Trapped in Death Cave by Bill Wallace, Chapter 9. About a mile past the Wichita Mountain Y, Mrs. Becker slowed the cycle. She drove with one hand. With her other, she took the flashlight. She waved it back and forth on the side of the road. It's been 12 years since I've been around here, but I bet I'll remember the trail mark if I see it. She kept shining the light. The cycle kept moving slower and slower until finally it had stopped. Mrs. Becker let it idle, shining her light on a big cottonwood tree close to the road. There was a long diamond-shaped boulder leaning up against the side of the tree. Finally, she glanced over her shoulder. "This is it, Brian. That marks the creek bed that leads to Snake Dancer's cave. Hang on." The cycle jumped forward again. Brian clung tight to her waist. They roared right past the cottonwood tree, only inches from it. They bounced some when they left the road, and on the other side of the tree, Mrs. Becker turned sharply and almost flipped them. But instead of turning over, they ended up in a dry creek bed and went racing on. Brian leaned close to Mrs. Becker's ear. "You think we ought to slow down?" he pleaded. Mrs. Becker shook her head. "Creek's flat for about a quarter of a mile. I'll slow down when we leave the creek and start climbing towards the cliff." So they raced on, raced over the small rocks in the bottom of the creek, swished past the huge boulders and solid granite rock that poked from the banks of either side, roared under the low-hanging limbs of the tree that kept them ducking and weaving from side to side, and Mrs. Becker didn't slow down one little bit. Things went just fine for a while. Then there was a loud, twanging sound. Brian felt the cycle stopped dead. Only he and Mrs. Becker kept right on going. All of a sudden, he was flying in the air, and something hit his foot. He lost his grip on Mrs. Becker and went flying off in a direction all by himself, while Mrs. Becker went flying in another. Things flipped over and over, upside down and crossways. Then he went sliding into the ground. The little rocks along the side of the creek bit at his shoulder and leg. He was thankful that it had rained earlier. The water had made the creek bed muddy, and it made his fall softer. After a minute, when things stopped spinning, Brian sat up and looked around. The motorcycle engine had died after the crash. Everything was quiet. Brian just knew Mrs. Becker was dead. She was too old to take a fall like that. Then all of a sudden, he heard an angry muttering. "Ruined," the voice growled. "Dang sloppy mud. Best dress I own, and now it's ruined." Brian looked around. Mrs. Becker was standing a few feet away. She shined her light down on her dress and was trying to scrape some of the mud off. She was muddy from head to toe. Her dress was torn in a couple of places, but other than that, she looked as spry as ever. After working to get the mud off for a time, she finally gave up. She turned her light back to where the cycle had wrecked. "Darn fool farmer. Who'd have thought some crazy farmer would string a new fence across that creek?" She turned the light on Brian. "You all right, boy?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good. You was right." She came over and helped him to his feet. "I should have slowed down like you said. We mustn't been doing at least 40 when we hit the barbed wire fence. I sure didn't know any farmer had put that fence up. Sorry." Brian brushed himself off. "That's all right. I'm glad Are you sure you're not hurt?" "Nope, I'm fine. Couple of bruises, that's all." She turned the light around, trying to get her bearings. She scratched her head and shrugged. "Ain't sure, but I think it's this way. Come on. We're only about half a mile away." Brian followed her out of the creek bed and onto the rock-covered ground beyond the banks. It seemed like most of the time they were climbing, they'd top a small hill, then walk down into a little valley, then struggle up a higher hill. Mrs. Becker set a good pace. Her old legs carried her smoothly over the rocky ground. Brian had to work to keep up with her, but after a while the climbing began to slow her down. In front of him, Brian could hear her breathing. Her air came in shorter and shorter gasps. Finally, she had to stop to rest. "Just not as young as I used to be," she puffed. Brian tried to make her stay there and rest, but before he knew it, she was on her feet again. In the distance, Brian could hear the storm. The rumbling of the thunder seemed to roll and echo from the hills all around them, a constant roaring like the thunder was going to last forever. They came to a steep part of the hill. Brian shined his light and found a straight cliff. It looked impossible to climb, but instead of going up it, Mrs. Becker turned sharply to the right, and in a minute they were back in the creek bed. They followed it to the base of the cliff. There, the creek had cut a narrow gorge in the rocks. It was deep and slant, yet there were plenty of handholds and footholds so they could climb. As they climbed, Brian shined his light all around. In some places, giant boulders had fallen from the tops of the cliffs and wedged about halfway down in the deep gorge, blotting out the night sky. In other places, there were many of them clumped above. They blocked out the flashes of light from the coming storm. Finally, they reached the top of the gorge. Mrs. Becker was puffing and panting like she was fixing to drop. It took her a long time to catch her breath. "We'd best be quiet from here on," she whispered. "Whoever stole Gary, Grandpa's map, is probably already at the cave. I just pray your friend is still with them and that he's still all right." A big boulder blocked the end of the gorge. They had to climb around it. Struggling and straining to reach the top, Brian got to the top of the big rock first. He leaned down and helped Mrs. Becker up. Then he turned to see where they were. The lightning flashed in a long, twisting finger that raced across the whole sky. The light lasted long enough for Brian to see what was in front of them. A green, flat valley opened just beyond the gorge. It was as big as a football field, only round instead of squared off. On all sides, sheer rock cliffs rose toward the black sky. They were as smooth and straight as if some giant had taken a knife and sliced them off. At the far end of the meadow, there was a big tree beside a pool of water. "There," Mrs. Becker whispered, "where the cliffs rise up behind that big tree. Come on." She tugged at his elbow, leading him along a little stream that twisted its way from the pool to the edge of the gorge where they stood. Brian didn't realize how strange and eerie the place was until they started walking across the meadow. The lightning flashed and rumbled again. Brian could see then just how high the cliffs were. They completely surrounded the small valley. Tall and sharp, they seemed to cut the valley off from everywhere else on the face of the earth. It was a place all alone, different from any other in the whole world. The sheer cliffs caught the roaring boom of the thunder. The sound bounced from the towering walls, clattering and rumbled, made the ground shake beneath their feet. A sudden flash of lightning came close, just above the cliffs. Brian froze, startled and frightened by the bright light and following roar that hurt his ears. Mrs. Becker reached out her hand and took his. She stood there and waited. Another flash of lightning came. She pointed to the tree. Just above it, Brian could see the gaping hole in the face of the rock cliff. The lightning lit up everything else. Only the mouth of the cave stayed dark, black as death itself. Mrs. Becker leaned close. "This is the scared valley of the snake dancer," she whispered. The lightning came again. She pointed up to the cave, and that the Indians used to call Death Cave. Brian felt the chills race up his back. His hair bristled out on his neck. He could barely breathe. He had the feeling that eyes were watching him. He could see no one else around, yet still he had the feeling, that burning cold feeling on his eyes, on the back of his neck. Eyes that were there but not there. Sounds behind him, sounds that stopped when he turned to look. And there was a cold, icy feeling deep down in the pit of his stomach. This was the sacred place of snake dancers. Probably in all time, no more than a handful of white men had ever set eyes on the place. And as Grandpa's story raced over and over in Brian's mind, he realized that none of the white people that had seen this place lived to tell about it.